Welcome to another episode of Elevate Maryland for our Elevate mini series. We're very excited today to have David Parrish on the show to talk about his new book, Losing Jon. And just to put this in context, on May 4th, 1990, 20-year-old John Bowie was found hanging from a basketball backstop at Oakland Mills High School. That prior January, John and his twin brother had been charged with resisting arrest and filed reciprocal brutality complaints against two Howard County police officers. While John's death was originally ruled as suicide, it was later described as an unaccompanied death, and his family suspects foul play. David Parrish is on to discuss his investigative account of this dark chapter in Howard County's history, which is titled Losing Jon. And he actually told us as we were prepping that this thing is selling out on Amazon. So welcome to the show, David, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
We are really glad to have you here. You know, I was saying before we got the show started, I was in high school when this happened, and I remember this. It's one of those things that you remember from high school, not a good thing that I remember from high school. I had a number of friends who went to Oakland Mills High School, and I was at Howard High School at the time. And I can remember how this affected our community, our very young community, if you think about it. You know, we're 16, 17, 18, 19 years old, and I can remember distinctly how this affected our community. So we're glad to have you on the show to talk about this, even though it's a challenging subject.
Yeah, so with that, David, if you would just sort of, you heard my context, but if you would describe for us, what is this book about? What happened here?
In short version, this book is about what it's like to be behind the scenes when you're in a family that's ignored by the justice system. I knew the Bowie twins because I coached as a parent coach in recreational league baseball from the time they were 11 until they graduated from high school. They were the kind of kids that other kids wanted to be like, and they were just a pleasure to be around. The teams had sort of a tight-knit way about them. I knew the parents mainly from chatting on the sidelines. Sometimes after games, we'd go out for hamburgers. And over time, I got to know them a little better. The Bowie twins came over to my house a few times for sleepovers. My sons went over to their house, their apartment. And then they graduated, got scholarships to go to North Dakota State to play baseball. Mickey was going to play football. They decided they just would rather be at home, so they came back and were in winter break during their sophomore year in college, when 15 young college students decided that they would rent a hotel room to just catch up on each other's lives, and that's kind of where the story began.
And so tell us a little bit about the story. What did you find out, and give, instead, for our listeners who have not read the book, who have not heard this, or who weren't in high school at the time here in Howard County, tell us what this is about. What happened?
At the hotel, to make a long story short, things went sour. Police showed up to respond to a noise complaint. John and Mickey were beaten brutally with nightsticks, fists. Mickey's face was ground into the sidewalk with one officer's boot while his hands were handcuffed behind his back. They filed complaints, and then in the following weeks, they pressed charges, both criminal and with the police department, against 3 of the officers. They reported being harassed and followed for the next several weeks. And then in May 4th, 1990, which is tomorrow, the 30th anniversary of John Bowie's death, John was found hanged at the backstop behind Oakland Mills High School. And in all honesty, when I first heard, I was at work, having to work late that day. My wife called me, and she just said, "I've got terrible news." And she said that John had been found dead, and that his body was, no, she didn't tell me about the backstop. She just wanted me to know. And I came home, and I thought he'd done it. I thought, that's terrible. It just doesn't sound like John. But the more I learned, the more I thought, there's just no way. And the thing that really triggered it in my mind, I went by to offer condolences to the family. There was a huge crowd still. It was getting late in the evening. There was a huge crowd still gathered in the parking lot in front of his house, his townhouse. I offered my condolences to the family, spoke with Mickey, and then sat at the kitchen table talking with several adults. The family attorney came and explained that Jon wasn't really hanging from the backstop as a lot of people thought. He was literally up against the wire of the backstop. I hate to be too graphic, but just clutching the wire with his face resting on the backstop, his hands on the top. And I was stunned. He was one of the most agile kids I'd ever coached. And I just thought, somebody has to take a look at this that doesn't have something to be gained, because by that time I had learned that the police came straight to the house to tell the parents it was a suicide. If the parents had not objected, there would have been no investigation. There would have been no autopsy. And then in the weeks following, there just didn't seem to be a serious investigation. You were reading things in the newspaper, like the chief of police called a press conference to literally, quote, quell rumors that it was anything but a suicide. We had a community meeting with the chief of police and several officers and some community members, and it was an entirely too defensive meeting of trying to explain things away instead of taking this case seriously. And it continued that way.
And so what additional information was discovered? Because I read, parts of your book and then some of the news coverage that is it correct that they changed the classification from a suicide to a, quote, unaccompanied death?
They did, but in my mind, that was just a play on games. That was just their way to end the conversation. I didn't see that as being greatly substantive because they still said, when they say unattended, they mean nobody else was there, that he put the cable around his neck, that he was just, they think he was playing around and fell asleep on the backstop and just quietly went to sleep. And I'll tell you an anecdote that's not in the book, but it's meaningful to me. I won't show them, but I have pictures of his body on the backstop. And I have friends who are police officers. I don't want anybody to think this is an anti-police book. It's not. And I was having breakfast with one recently who asked me what one of the investigating agents had said, and I repeated that part about how they said he had just fallen asleep and it was a prank that went awry. My friend who had seen the pictures said, "That is the stupidest thing I've ever heard." And this was from a police officer. But there's so many things that never made it in the newspapers that that's one reason I wrote the book. I wanted people to hear those things. And I don't want to spoil the book for people, but just to give you an idea, at the time, his body was declared a suicide at the scene, taken straight to a funeral home. Before it was even removed from the scene, someone was breaking into his house and his front door was locked. I confirmed that with the family. And you say, come on, guys, take this thing seriously. The police knew everything we knew. And the end result was 3 different agencies investigated. And for some reason, every one of them backed off.
I can remember, and I don't know if I read this in the newspaper or if this was just conversation at the time, but some folks were talking about some witness intimidation as well, that there were some witnesses who were coming forth to testify, and there was some intimidation, or somebody was injured, one of the witnesses was injured. Do you remember anything about that, or do you cover that in the book?
Absolutely. Because I got to know the young people who were at the motel, and one of the family attorneys asked me to talk with them and try to persuade them to tell their stories. And I learned about kids during the grand jury who were getting calls threatening them. The one that was the most stunning was a young man was sitting at the backstop the night before he was to testify against the police. And the story he tells, and I heard him tell it firsthand, was that he was sitting at the backstop and someone came up behind him, wrapped a cord around his neck, walked him into the woods. He fainted and woke up the next day under a bridge running over a creek. And he got a phone call. He went home. He got a phone call that saying, "I see you're still alive." And that really upset him. He went to the hospital, just hyperventilating, and then showed up in court to testify. But that was one of many times when the court hearings got canceled. And it was after that that I heard him tell that story.
And what became of the police officers that that were involved in this, both the ones that the brutality complaints were filed against, and any others that your book includes?
As was very common at that time, and maybe now, they went through the system. The Internal Affairs Department found them guilty of misconduct at some level. But then there is something called a police trial board where 3 police officers serve as an appellate body, and they overturned that ruling.
And did they continue to serve in Howard County for the remainder of their careers, or do we know that?
I didn't follow it closely after that. To my knowledge, 2 of them did. One resigned and moved out of state.
What's your goal and interest in bringing the story to light now? And what do you think can happen by doing that?
I have several goals. The reason I wrote it down in the first place is I wanted the public to know those things that never got into the newspapers, that the family knew, that I knew, that every investigating agency knew, and yet just discounted. So one goal, I always had this feeling that if people knew what we knew, they just wouldn't want to put up with this kind of thing. I also wanted, I'm kind of glad that at that time, it was as if a police officer could do anything and nothing was going to happen. And that seems to be one of the things that has become a part of a national conversation now, that some things are, at least to some level, no longer being tolerated. And I would be very pleased if this book could contribute to that. And I really would be pleased if someone felt safe coming forward and providing information, and we actually could learn what happened to John.
Now, in just living in this community, and I had heard about John before, I had heard about this story before, but I also had sort of felt and experienced a lot of reticence from particularly those that were, I guess, more adult age at the time of John's death to talk about this or reopen it in any way. Did you find that, did you encounter that when you were researching this book?
Not the second time around. Back during that time, there was considerable amount of reticence. I think people are afraid to say anything about the police. I mean, who are you going to call when your house gets broken into? You're going to call the police. You don't want to feel like they don't like you. And as I said, I think this is not an anti-police book. I have tremendous respect for those people who do their jobs well. But certainly at that time, newspapers were dependent on police for the stories they were going to get. I had a reporter tell me that they could only say so much because they had the police circuit, and if they didn't make friends with the police, they're out of a job. Well, I understand that, so they have to watch what they say. I had another young reporter told the family that he would try to get as much into the newspapers as he could, but there was only so much he could get past his editors. So there was a certain political element to it. I've served on this committee that supposedly was looking into the police, And I only served on it, to be honest, to keep Jon's name and to keep the case in the public eye, because it was apparent from day one that they weren't really going to accomplish anything. Nowadays, I really do believe it's changing. Now, all you have to do is read the Baltimore papers to find out it's not completely changed. But like I said, I have friends who are police officers, and one in particular tells me that where they work, it simply would not be put up with anymore. So it's not a completely negative perspective.
You mentioned that you had a personal relationship with Jon and his brother Mickey, and I guess the question I would have is, how's the family receiving this? I'm sure they read the book, and what have they said about it, and how do they feel about it?
They're one of the main reasons I was able to write the book. They just answered question after question, told me everything they could possibly tell me. They corrected things that I thought I knew. When Jon died, we weren't close friends. We just were acquaintances. But over time, like anybody, I wasn't the only one. There were lots of neighbors and friends and family and acquaintances who were doing anything they could to support this family. And so you gained access to things that not everybody did. And over time, I got access to court records, taped interviews with the police, police reports, all that information, just trying to make sure the police got it. And the family was in step all the way. They appreciated the support. And one of the blessings of attending to it again after all these years was that I got back in touch with the family, and they've been extremely supportive.
And in the course of researching this, did you uncover additional evidence or information that may provide a basis for reopening this investigation? We have a new state's attorney in there, a new police chief, anything that they might want to look into?
My biggest hope along that line, the answer to your question really is not really. What I uncovered was so many reasons to believe that this case should have been taken seriously. And that's what's in the book. My literary agent likes to call it a landmine of information. It just keeps popping up in all kinds of ways. And I just tried to make sure that the user would hear those things. For a case to be reopened, I would assume that somebody would have to come forward. And I would not be surprised if people who were involved in Jon's death are still around. I can't say that I know what happened. I was kind of careful not to draw conclusions. I just wanted the reader to see what I knew. And I think it would be a blessing if someone came forward with information and presented it to responsible agencies who took it seriously.
And when you say people, I'm sorry for interrupting you, but the people that you're thinking of in terms of coming forward, do you think this would be fellow police officers? Do you think this would be potentially witnesses that were afraid to come forward at the time?
Possibly both, and possibly even something more serious than that, something outside the police department. There's a part in the book that talks about something that Jon did to try to give credibility to his charges against the police. And a dear friend of mine that I gained during that time, who's now deceased, Reverend David Rogers, was a local activist and minister, and he interviewed a young man who said that Jon had, with this person's encouragement, that indicated that it might be that Jon had accidentally stumbled onto something criminal that he didn't realize what he was getting into. And there might or might not have been police officers involved in that. But it was serious business, and it was something that, in my opinion, could only be handled by a responsible investigating agency.
What would you want our listeners to know about Jon? Who was Jon?
Jon was a remarkable, happy-go-lucky team leader. He was captain of when he was a senior, captain of his varsity baseball team. position of responsibility and honor. He and Mickey both were, as I said, the kind of kids that other kids wanted to be like. They were sort of the gel of a good team. Just pleasant people to be around. And the way I used to describe them was to both of them. The sky was blue, the grass was green, and if you didn't want to know, don't ask. They were very honest people.
And asking more about you, this is your first book, I believe. What has that experience been like to become a published author and then to get a notification from Amazon saying they're almost out of your book? That's got to be quite an experience.
I had no intention of writing a book. I just had all this information, and when it became obvious that it was just going to get lost in time, I just thought it was important to write it down and to give people an opportunity to see the things that I had seen. And people ask, am I excited about the book? No, it's not the kind of thing you get excited about. I'm glad the story's getting told.
And
well,
I'm sorry,
go ahead.
one last question. Where can Amazon is selling the book? If people want to get in contact with you and have more questions or even want to discuss the book, I saw a little, I think I mentioned this to you, a Facebook discussion that a friend of mine was having with a couple of people, and they were asking questions and wanting to engage. And there was even a talk about a book club. So if people want to get in contact with you, how do they do that?
Well, this subject has sort of taken over my personal Facebook page, which is David Parrish. I'm the guy standing there against a boat rail with a blue golf shirt on.
Great. And then the folks can find the book on Amazon, right?
They can find it anywhere books are sold. The publisher and my literary agent, the publicist have done a fantastic job of getting the book out there.
Great. And I'm going to plug bookshop.org because it promotes independent bookstores. But
thank you.
David, I want to, just before we sign off, extend a thank you from many in the Oakland Mills community that have sort of had this story in their history and have appreciated the opportunity to learn more about it. So like you said, it's not necessarily something to be excited about, but to have this sort of examined in the way that you did it, in the respectful way that you've done it. I've heard a lot from folks over there that are appreciating the book and you. So thank you for that. And thank you for coming on our show.
Thank you for having me on.
It's great to have you.